September 26, 1918. Northern France, the Meuse-Argonne forest. It is 5:30 a.m. and the ground is shaking. For the past 3 hours, over 2,700 American artillery guns have been firing without pause into the German lines. It is the largest artillery barrage in American military history. The sky to the east is orange. The fog is so thick that soldiers 10 feet apart can barely see each other. Corporal James Whitfield of the 77th Infantry Division is pressed against the forward trench wall with 12 other men. He is 22 years old. He grew up on a farm in western Tennessee. He knows how to plow a field, how to fix a fence, how to hunt white-tailed deer in the Cumberland Hills at dawn. And slung across his back, alongside his standard infantry kit, is a weapon that his sergeant pressed into his hands 2 days ago with 4 words: "Use it in the trench." It is a Winchester Model 1897 pump-action shotgun, the same model his father kept behind the kitchen door back home. The Army has welded a metal heat shield over the barrel. There is a bayonet fixed to the muzzle. At exactly 5:30 a.m., the whistle blows. What happens in the next 4 hours will help end the First World War, and 3 weeks later, the Imperial German government will send a formal diplomatic protest to Washington, demanding that the United States Army stop using one specific weapon. Not poison gas, not the flamethrower, not artillery. A shotgun, an American shotgun. And this is the secret reason they were terrified of it. To understand why a shotgun changed the calculus of World War I, you first need to understand what trench warfare actually looked like, not the sanitized version from textbooks, but the terrifying, claustrophobic, suffocating reality that millions of men endured for 4 years. By 1917, the Western Front had become one of the most stagnant killing grounds in history. Stretching over 700 kilometers from the English Channel to the Swiss border, the front was a maze of interlocking trenches, sometimes only 50 to 100 meters apart. German trenches faced Allied trenches across a strip of no man's land pockmarked with shell craters, rotting bodies, and rusted wire. These weren't just ditches in the ground. The German defensive positions in particular were engineering marvels, reinforced with concrete, equipped with electricity, stocked with food and ammunition. They were designed to be held indefinitely. And that created a very specific tactical problem. When soldiers raided enemy trenches, a common nighttime operation designed to gather intelligence, take prisoners, and destroy supplies, they were operating in spaces roughly the width of a single person. In that environment, a rifle was nearly useless. Too long to swing, too slow to reload, too precise for a target only 3 feet away. The standard-issue bolt-action rifles of World War I, the German Gewehr 98, the British Lee-Enfield Springfield M1903, were masterpieces of precision engineering, accurate to 600 yards, devastating at range, completely wrong for a trench raid. The Allies tried various solutions: pistols, knives, clubs. Literally medieval-looking clubs studded with nails were standard issue for British trench raiders. Grenades helped, but the narrow corridors of a trench could turn a grenade into a double-edged weapon just as easily. Then American forces arrived in France, and they brought something with them that would change everything. They brought the Winchester Model 1897, the trench gun. The Winchester Model 1897 was not designed for war. It was designed by one of the most brilliant firearms engineers America ever produced, John Moses Browning, and it was built to sell to farmers, hunters, and homesteaders across the American West. Browning had already made Winchester's fortune. His designs were legendary for their reliability, their elegance, and their lethality in the field. The Model 1897 was a pump-action shotgun. The pump design itself was an innovation that made it one of the fastest-firing shotguns in the world. Where a double-barreled shotgun gave you 2 shots before a reload, an experienced shooter with the Model 1897 could fire all 5 rounds in under 3 seconds. Let that sink in. 5 rounds under 3 seconds. For context, a trained infantryman with a bolt-action rifle, using the mad minute technique the British Army famously trained, could fire 15 rounds per minute. That was considered extraordinary. The Winchester 1897 could theoretically deliver over 100 rounds per minute in the hands of a skilled operator. But raw speed wasn't the only advantage. The shotgun shell itself, loaded with buckshot, roughly 9 to 15 lead balls per shell, didn't need to be aimed precisely. In a trench 8 feet wide and 6 feet deep, a single blast could fill the corridor with a spread pattern that nothing could escape. Soldiers called it pattern fire. In practice, it meant this: even if your hands were shaking from fear and adrenaline, even if the lighting was non-existent, even if the man in front of you was moving, you were going to hit him, hard, multiple times simultaneously. The psychological dimension of this was enormous. A bullet wound, as horrifying as it sounds, was understood. Soldiers had been trained, mentally if not physically, to accept the possibility of being shot. But multiple simultaneous impacts from a single trigger pull? That was something different. Something that broke through the psychological conditioning that warfare demands. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, the War Department recognized the potential of the shotgun for close-quarters combat almost immediately. They ordered modifications to the civilian design: a heat shield mounted over the barrel to protect the shooter's hands during rapid fire, and a bayonet lug that allowed the attachment of a standard M1917 bayonet. The result was something that looked almost like a weapon designed by someone who had never seen a battlefield: a long wooden stock, a tubular magazine, a pump that clicked with a sound unlike any military weapon in the world, but functioned like a nightmare in the trenches of France. The Army designated it officially as the riot gun, a name that is, when you think about it, deeply American. A weapon developed for civilian crowd control, repurposed for the most catastrophic conflict the world had ever seen. The first reports from German frontline commanders were, by the standards of wartime communication, almost panicked. German soldiers returning from failed raids or prisoner exchanges described something that didn't fit the vocabulary of modern warfare. They described a weapon that didn't sound like a rifle. They described wounds that looked different from rifle wounds. And they described the speed, the relentless mechanical speed of American shotgun fire, as deeply destabilizing. In October 1918, just weeks before the armistice, the Imperial German government took the extraordinary step of formally protesting the use of American shotguns through diplomatic channels. Their legal argument was grounded in the Hague Convention of 1907, specifically Article 23E, which prohibited the use of arms, projectiles, or material calculated to cause unnecessary suffering. The German protest stated, in essence, that the buckshot pellets used in American trench guns caused wounds that were unnecessarily severe, that a shotgun blast, by design, created multiple wound tracks in the human body, rather than the single, clean penetration of a rifle bullet. There was a certain dark irony in this argument that was not lost on Allied commanders or on American newspapers when they heard about it. This was, after all, the same German military that had pioneered the use of poison gas on the Western Front, the same German military that had fielded flamethrowers, the same German military whose submarine warfare had killed thousands of civilians at sea. And now their formal complaint was about a shotgun. The American response was measured, legal, and absolute. The Judge Advocate General's Office of the United States Army reviewed the German protest and issued a formal memorandum that destroyed the legal argument, point by point. First, the Hague Convention applied to arms calculated to cause unnecessary suffering, a standard that had never been interpreted to prohibit shotguns, which had been in widespread civilian and law enforcement use for decades. Second, there was no evidence that buckshot caused unnecessary suffering relative to other accepted weapons of war. A bullet wound was a bullet wound. The number of projectiles involved did not change the legal analysis. Third, and this was the part that carried the most weight historically, the United States Army had a sovereign right to equip its soldiers with any legal weapon it chose. The German protest had no binding authority, no mechanism for enforcement, and no legal standing under any treaty the United States had signed. The U.S. Army's response concluded with something that, in the dry language of legal memoranda, was essentially a polite but firm rebuke. American soldiers would continue to carry and use their shotguns, and the German government's protest would be noted but not acted upon. And then, just to make the point absolutely clear, American commanders reportedly issued instructions that if any American soldier were captured by German forces and found to be carrying a shotgun, Germany had threatened to execute him on the spot, claiming the weapon was illegal. The American response to this threat? They issued a counter-threat of their own. For every American soldier executed for carrying a shotgun, the United States would hold equivalent German prisoners accountable under the laws of war. The executions never happened, but the fact that this exchange occurred at all tells you something profound about how much the shotgun had gotten inside the German military's head. Numbers and legal memoranda can only tell you so much. To understand what the shotgun really meant in the trenches, you need to understand the men who carried it. Sergeant Fred Lloyd of the 5th Marines wrote home to his family in Virginia in the summer of 1918. He described his first trench raid with a Winchester 1897 in language that was, even by the standards of wartime correspondence, remarkably candid. He wrote, "Before, going over the top at night, there was always a moment, you all know it, where your hands go cold and your stomach turns to water. When I had the old Winchester, I noticed that moment had changed. Not gone, never gone, but different. Like I knew something nobody on the other side of the wire knew yet." That phrase, "like I knew something nobody on the other side of the wire knew yet," captures something essential about the psychological dimension of the shotgun in trench warfare. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a confidence multiplier, a psychological edge that operated on both sides of the equation. It made American soldiers more confident, and it made German soldiers more afraid. Consider what a trench raid actually looked like in practice. A team of anywhere from 5 to 20 men would slip over the parapet of their own trench in the dead of night, crawl across no man's land, often under sporadic artillery fire, always through mud that could swallow a man to his waist, and then penetrate the German wire and drop down into the enemy's defensive system. For the next 20 to 45 minutes, they would be alone in enemy territory, out of communication with their own lines, operating in near total darkness against an enemy who knew his own trench system intimately, and they did not. In this environment, the shotgun's advantages compounded on each other in ways that a simple technical description cannot capture. The darkness. In a trench at 2 in the morning, there was almost no light. Aimed fire with a rifle was nearly impossible. The shotgun required almost no aim, pointed in the direction of movement and fire. The spread did the rest. The noise. The crack of a rifle in a confined trench space was disorienting for everyone, friendly and enemy alike. The boom of a shotgun was something else entirely. It filled the space completely. It was physically felt as well as heard, and it had a profoundly different psychological signature. Veterans described it as unstoppable, not a single lethal instrument, but something more elemental. The reload. The pump action of the Model 1897 had a feature that no other military weapon of its time shared. It could be fired as fast as the shooter could pump the action, without waiting for the trigger to reset. This meant that a skilled operator could slam fire, holding the trigger depressed and working the pump continuously, emptying all 5 rounds in a blur of motion that was functionally automatic. The slam fire capability was something German soldiers had never encountered from any Allied weapon. It was a feature that, when encountered for the first time in a dark trench, must have seemed almost supernatural in its speed. Private Heinrich Brauer, captured by American forces in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September 1918, was interviewed by American military intelligence officers shortly after his capture. His account, preserved in records at the National Archives, describes his first encounter with American trench guns in language that is striking for its specificity. Brauer described hearing a sound like a machine gun, but different, more like thunder coming from inside the trench, not outside it. He described seeing 2 of his comrades hit simultaneously by a single shot, a wound pattern that he initially couldn't process because nothing in his experience had produced it. He described, above all, the speed. Before you could understand what was happening, he said, it was already done. This was the essential terror of the American trench gun. In warfare, understanding your enemy's weapons is a form of psychological protection. You can prepare for a rifle. You can develop tactics against a machine gun. You can learn to recognize and respond to artillery. But the shotgun, with its unfamiliar sound, its multiple simultaneous impacts, its extraordinary rate of fire, sat outside the mental framework that German soldiers had developed over 3 years of war. And what you cannot categorize, you cannot control. What you cannot control, you fear. The story of the American military shotgun did not end in 1918. If anything, the Second World War demonstrated that the lessons of the Western Front had not been forgotten, and that in certain environments, the shotgun remained without peer. In the Pacific Theater, American Marines and Army infantry encountered terrain that made the Western Front look spacious. The jungles of Guadalcanal, New Georgia, Peleliu, and the Philippines were so dense that visibility could drop to less than 10 feet. Japanese defensive positions were concealed with extraordinary skill. Ambushes came without warning from distances measured in yards, not hundreds of meters. In this environment, the precision rifle that had been the dominant weapon of Western warfare for a century was once again the wrong tool for the job. The Winchester Model 1897 was supplemented and eventually largely replaced by the Winchester Model 1912, a more modern, sleeker design that loaded faster and was easier to maintain in the brutal humidity of the Pacific. But the principle remained the same. In close-quarters combat, firepower spread across a wide pattern beat precision at range. Marines who fought on Guadalcanal described the shotgun as the jungle weapon, not in a grandiose way, but in the practical language of men who knew that their lives depended on having the right tool at the right moment. In the narrow jungle trails of the Solomon Islands, an enemy soldier could appear at arm's length without warning. A rifle demanded aiming. A shotgun demanded only pointing. There's a story, and it has the ring of truth to it, even if the specific details have been polished by decades of retelling, of a Marine gunnery sergeant on Guadalcanal who carried both an M1 Garand and a Winchester 1897. He carried the Garand for the work at range, he carried the shotgun for the nights. At night, he reportedly said, nobody shoots straight. With the shotgun, you don't have to. That's not bravado, that's physics. And it's a lesson that the United States military had learned, first in the trenches of France and then confirmed in the jungles of the Pacific. The shotgun's role in WWI generated enormous newspaper coverage in the United States. At a time when the war was profoundly unpopular, when American mothers were burying their sons in French mud for a conflict that seemed to have nothing to do with America, the story of German soldiers formally protesting the American shotgun had an almost comic quality that American newspapers played up relentlessly. Huns demand ban on shotgun, read one headline from October 1918. Germany says American farmer's weapon too terrible for war, read another. The subtext was always the same. These were weapons built by ordinary Americans for ordinary American life, and they were terrifying the most professional military force in the world. The tactical legacy of the American trench gun is alive and well in the 21st century. Today, the United States military and law enforcement agencies worldwide still deploy pump-action shotguns for specific close-quarters applications, building clearing, shipboarding, breaching. The weapon that German diplomats called a violation of civilized warfare in 1918 is now standard equipment in every major military on Earth. The Benelli M4, the current U.S. military standard combat shotgun, officially designated the M1014, is a direct descendant of the design philosophy that won those dark debates in 1917 and 1918. In close quarters, firepower spread matters more than precision. The shotgun has never been replaced in that role because nothing has been invented that replaces it better. The German protest of 1918 was, in retrospect, not a legal argument. It was an admission. It was Germany's professional military establishment acknowledging, in the most formal way available to them, that American forces had deployed a weapon that their doctrine, their training, and their psychological preparation could not adequately address. That is the secret the Germans didn't want to say out loud. They weren't just afraid of the shotgun. They were afraid of the men who chose to carry it. The armistice came on November 11, 1918. By that point, American forces had been in the war for less than 2 years, but the impact of their arrival, in numbers, in equipment, and in morale, had been decisive. The shotgun was a small piece of that story, a single weapon, used by a fraction of the soldiers in a fraction of the engagements. But its outsized psychological impact, the German protest, the newspaper headlines, the stories told by veterans, made it a symbol that outlasted its tactical role. In the immediate aftermath of the war, military analysts in both the United States and Europe began seriously studying the lessons of trench warfare. The conclusions that emerged would shape military doctrine for the next century. Close-quarters combat required different weapons than open-field engagement. This seems obvious in retrospect, but in 1914 it was not obvious at all. It had to be learned at enormous cost. The shotgun was one of the instruments of that education. The analysis of the German protest was also intellectually important. It forced military lawyers and strategists to think carefully about what the laws of war actually meant when applied to weapons technology. Was a weapon illegal because of how it felt to be hit by it, or was legality determined by more objective standards? The Geneva Conventions of the 1920s and 1930s addressed these questions with increasing precision. Shotguns were never prohibited. The German position of 1918 was never vindicated in international law. What the whole episode demonstrated instead was the gap between the theoretical framework of the laws of war developed in peacetime by lawyers and diplomats and the practical reality of what happened when soldiers tried to survive in the trenches. There is something worth dwelling on in the German protest. It reveals a kind of cognitive dissonance at the heart of industrial warfare. Nations had accepted by 1918 the use of artillery that could kill dozens simultaneously, poison gas that caused agonizing deaths over hours or days, and machine guns that could cut down hundreds of men in a minute. These were legal, but a shotgun, a weapon that had been in civilian hands for decades, was somehow beyond the pale. The protest reveals not a coherent legal principle, but a psychological one. What we understand, we can accept, even when it kills us. What we do not understand, we call illegal. There is a Winchester Model 1897 trench gun on display at the National Infantry Museum in Columbus, Georgia. It is behind glass. The wood of the stock is worn smooth in the places where hands have held it. The heat shield over the barrel shows the discoloration of heavy use. It looks, in some ways, like any other antique firearm you might find in any sporting goods store in rural America, and that, in a way, is the whole point. The story of the German fear of American shotguns is not, at its deepest level, a story about a weapon. It's a story about what happens when one culture's assumptions about violence encounter another culture's pragmatism about it. Germany in 1918 was a nation that had been preparing for industrial warfare for decades. Its military doctrine, its officer corps, its weapons systems, all of it was designed around a specific vision of what modern war should look like: precision, range, discipline, order. America came to that war with no such tradition. American soldiers had grown up with guns that were tools for feeding families, for defending homesteads, for solving immediate practical problems. When they looked at the problem of the trench raid, they didn't ask, what does military doctrine say we should use? They asked, what will kill the enemy most effectively in this specific situation? And the answer to that second question was a pump-action shotgun from the hardware store. Fear in war is not simply a response to the threat of death. Death is omnipresent in war. Every soldier learns to live alongside the knowledge of their own mortality. Fear, in the psychological sense that matters tactically, is about the unknown. It's about encountering something that doesn't fit your mental map of the battlefield, that falls outside the categories your training has given you to process danger. The American shotgun did that to German soldiers. It wasn't more lethal than artillery by any objective measure. It was far less so. It wasn't even the most dangerous weapon in the American arsenal. But it was unfamiliar. It worked by different rules. It produced different effects. And in the narrow confines of a trench at 2 in the morning, unfamiliar was the most terrifying thing in the world. The men who carried the Winchester 1897 across no man's land in 1918 were mostly farm boys from Ohio and Kansas and Virginia. They didn't know they were making history. They didn't know that their choice of weapon would generate a diplomatic protest that historians would still be discussing a century later. They just knew that when they dropped into a German trench at 2 in the morning and the pump of the Winchester clicked, whatever came at them out of the darkness was going to have a very bad night. That confidence, earned, tested, practical, and deeply American, was perhaps the most important weapon of all. The shotgun was just the way they showed it.